The air was heavy with snow, blanketing the tiny village nestled deep in the mountains. Each house had a warm glow spilling from its windows, but there was something off about this place. The people who lived here didn't share the usual joy of Christmas. Instead, they moved with caution, their eyes darting to the forest beyond the village as if something was watching. It wasn't just the cold that made this village feel eerie. There was a story, an old tale that the villagers whispered about in hushed voices, the legend of Krampus. For generations, they believed that while Santa rewarded the good, Krampus came for the wicked. He was no jolly figure with a red suit and bag of gifts. He was something ancient, a creature that punished those who broke the rules. The villagers said Krampus had hooves like a beast, horns that curled menacingly from his head, and chains that rattled as he moved through the snow. Every Christmas Eve, the village held a tradition meant to keep Krampus at bay. Each family left an offering outside their homes, a plate of food, a small toy, and a note confessing their sins from the past year. No one questioned the tradition. It was as much a part of their Christmas as decorating a tree or singing carols. But the warnings that came with the ritual were clear. Never skip the offering and never mock the curse. This Christmas, a family from the city arrived to visit their relatives in the village. They came seeking peace and quiet, break from their busy lives. The parents, Emily and David, were eager to reconnect with David's brother Mark, who had lived in the village his entire life. Their two children, Sophie, 16, and Liam, 12, were less enthusiastic. They saw the village as boring and old-fashioned, far removed from the bustling city they were used to. The family settled into Mark's house, a cozy cottage on the edge of the forest. It was decorated with strings of lights and a small Christmas tree, but there was an unease in the air. Mark greeted them warmly, but he quickly became serious as he told them about the village's tradition. He warned them about the offering for Krampus, explaining the ritual in detail. "It may sound like an old fairy tale," he said, "but everyone here takes it seriously. You should too." Sophie rolled her eyes. "You don't really believe in that, do you?" she asked. Mark's face darkened. "Whether I believe or not doesn't matter. What matters is that no one breaks the tradition, ever." That evening, as the family sat by the fire, Mark told them a chilling story. It was about a boy who had lived in the village many years ago. He had mocked the Krampus legend, laughing at the villagers' fear. That Christmas Eve, the boy refused to leave an offering. He dared Krampus to come for him. The next morning, his family found his room empty. The bed was cold, and the only sign of him was a trail of hoofprints leading from his window to the forest. He was never seen again. Mark's voice lowered as he finished the story. Some say Krampus drags the wicked into the woods and keeps them there forever. Sophie and Liam exchanged nervous glances, but Sophie quickly brushed it off with a laugh. "It's just a scary story to keep kids in line," she said. Mark didn't argue, but his eyes carried a warning. As Christmas Eve fell, the village grew quieter than usual. Families placed their offerings on their doorsteps and locked their doors early. The air felt colder, and even the wind seemed afraid to blow. Sophie stared out the window at the dark forest. "It's ridiculous," she muttered to herself. "Who's afraid of a made-up monster?" She turned away from the window, but just before closing the curtains, she thought she saw something, a shadow moving between the trees. It was probably just her imagination, at least that's what she told herself. As the family settled in for the night, an unsettling silence wrapped around the village. The stars were hidden by clouds, and the only sound was the faint jingle of bells carried on the wind. Sophie tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping over her, but deep down, a small part of her couldn't shake the thought. What if the stories were true? The morning of Christmas Day arrived, but the festive cheer Sophie expected never came. She woke up to the sound of hushed voices downstairs. Pulling on a sweater, she descended to find Mark, Emily, and David standing near the front door. The expressions on their faces were tense. "What's going on?" Sophie asked, rubbing her eyes. Mark gestured toward the door. Sophie noticed deep scratches gouged into the wood, long and jagged, as though something with claws had raked across it. "It's probably just some animal," David said. Though his voice lacked conviction, Mark shook his head. No animal would leave this. He opened the door to reveal the snow-covered ground outside. Leading away from the house were strange tracks, hoofprints too large and irregular to belong to any ordinary creature. They seemed to drag slightly, as though something heavy had been pulled along. "What could have made those?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. Instead, he bent down to examine them, his face grim. "The villagers will want to see this," he finally said. The family accompanied Mark into the heart of the village, where a small crowd had gathered. It wasn't just their house that had been marked. Several others bore the same claw marks on their doors, and the hoofprints crisscrossed the village. They all led in one direction, toward the forest. The villagers were restless, their fear palpable. Someone didn't leave their offering, an older man muttered, his voice filled with accusation. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Sophie's stomach sank. She remembered her conversation with Mark about the offering, how she and Liam hadn't bothered to place one. It's just a coincidence, she thought, but she couldn't shake the unease growing inside her. One woman stepped forward, her face pale. "My son heard bells in the night," she said, "and now my dog is missing." Another villager chimed in. "This happened before, years ago, when that boy—" His voice trailed off, and the crowd grew silent, everyone remembering the story Mark had told. Mark turned to Sophie and Liam, his expression serious. "Did either of you forget the offering?" he asked quietly. Sophie hesitated, but forced herself to lie. "Of course we did," she said, her voice shaky. Liam looked down at his feet, unable to meet Mark's eyes. Mark didn't press them further, but Sophie could tell he didn't believe her. That night, the village seemed to hold its breath. The streets were empty, and every house was locked tight. Sophie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that everything was fine. But the silence outside felt wrong, almost oppressive. Then she heard it, the faint jingle of bells. She sat up, her heart pounding. It was soft at first, like a gentle chime it carried on the wind. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, more deliberate, as though whatever carried the bells was getting closer. Sophie crept to her window and peered outside. The forest loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding. At first, she saw nothing, but then, just at the edge of the trees, a shadow moved. It was tall, hunched, and monstrous, with glowing red eyes that hit through the darkness like embers. It stood still for a moment, staring back at her, before it turned and disappeared into the forest. Sophie stumbled back from the window, her breath quick and shallow. She wanted to scream, to wake the others, but the fear gripped her throat like a vice. The bells jingled again, louder this time, as if the creature was circling the house. And then, through the silence, she heard it, a low guttural growl that sent chills racing down her spine. Sophie realized something horrifying. The growl wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from inside the house. Sophie froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The growl echoed again, low and menacing, vibrating through the quiet of the house. She wanted to scream for her parents, but was too terrified to make a sound. Her eyes darted to the door, which was slightly ajar. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from Liam's room next door, followed by the sound of something being dragged. Sophie bolted out of bed, her fear overridden by panic for her brother. She swung open his door, expecting to find him there. The room was empty. Liam's bed was cold, his blanket tossed onto the floor. The window was wide open, letting in a blast of freezing air. Snowflakes swirled in the moonlight, and claw marks marred the windowsill, deep and jagged. A set of hoofprints began just outside, leading away into the night. "Liam!" Sophie screamed, rushing to the window. Her voice echoed into the dark forest, but no reply came. The only sound was the faint jingle of bells, growing fainter as though whatever had taken him was moving deeper into the woods. Her parents and Mark burst into the room moments later, their faces pale with fear. "What happened?" Emily cried, clutching Sophie's shoulders. "It took him," Sophie choked out, tears streaming down her face. "Krampus. It took Liam." Mark's face darkened, his worst fears confirmed. Without a word, he grabbed a flashlight and headed for the door. "We don't have much time," he said. "If we're going to get him back, we have to go now." The forest was pitch black, the only light coming from Mark's flickering flashlight. Sophie, David, and Emily followed close behind, their breath visible in the freezing air. The hoofprints were easy to track, pressed deep into the snow, as though something enormous had passed through. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. A thick shitty rolled in, muffling their footsteps and distorting the sounds around them. Sophie felt a creeping sense of dread. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle in the underbrush, a sign of something watching. "Do you really think we can save him?" she whispered to Mark. Mark didn't answer right away. "If Krampus has taken him, it's because the tradition was broken," he said. "We have to confront him, or none of us are making it out of here." Suddenly, the jingling bells returned, louder and closer than before. The sound surrounded them, echoing through the trees in every direction. Then came the growl, a deep, bone-chilling rumble that froze them in their tracks. Ahead of them, a massive shadow emerged from the fog. It was Krampus. Krampus was even more terrifying up close than Sophie had imagined. His twisted horns scraped the branches above, and his glowing red eyes burned with malice. His massive, fur-covered body was draped in chains that clinked as he moved, and his clawed hands gripped a whip made of barbed leather. Behind him, Sophie saw a large kenne, its bars made of twisted, gnarled wood. Inside was Liam, huddled in the corner, his face pale with fear. "Please let him go," Emily begged, stepping forward. But Krampus didn't even glance her way. Instead, he fixed his fiery gaze on Sophie, his lips curling into a wicked grin that revealed sharp, yellowed teeth. Mark stepped in front of Sophie, holding his flashlight like a weapon. "Take me instead," he said firmly. "This is my family. Let them go." Krampus tilted his head, considering the offer, but then he let out a guttural laugh that echoed through the forest, shaking the trees. "No," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "It's my fault. I broke the tradition. Take me." Krampus paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. For a brief moment, Sophie thought he might accept her offer, but then he raised his whip and lashed it toward the ground, the sound cracking through the air like thunder. The snow beneath their feet began to shift, and Sophie realized too late that it wasn't just snow, it was ice. The ground splintered, and a gaping chasm opened beneath her family. Sophie and her family screamed as they tumbled into the darkness. The fall seemed endless, the air growing colder with each passing second. When they finally landed, it was in a cavern of ice and shadow, the walls covered in jagged stalactites that dripped with crimson frost. Krampus stood above them, his massive form blocking out what little light remained. Around them were countless kids, each containing other lost souls, children and adults alike, taken over the years for breaking the traditions. "This is where the wicked remain," Krampus growled, his voice deep and otherworldly. "Your sins brought you here, and here you shall stay." Before Sophie could respond, the cage slammed shut around her family. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed them was Krampus's glowing red eyes and the cruel smile that spread across his face. In the village above, the morning came, but the family's house was silent. The only sign of them was a set of hoofprints leading back into the forest, and claw marks on their front door. The villagers whispered among themselves, mourning the family but also fearful of the next Christmas. Somewhere deep in the woods, the jingling of bells faded into the wind, a reminder that Krampus was still watching, waiting for the next soul to claim.